Hello and welcome back to the Go-Karts and Good Times YouTube channel. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and you may notice some striking similarities to the end of the last video, and that's because I'm starting this one right after. For a while now, I've been thinking of a good way to do movie nights either outside by a campfire or in the garage, which in my opinion is an underused space besides when I'm working on my projects. My plan for this was to set it up and have it hung by a 2x4 with a little platform from the ceiling so that I can project onto the back of the garage door. One problem with having people out here during the winter though is that it gets extremely cold. That is where this propane heater and some insulation comes in. As you can see, it's just plywood and space between the rafters of the roof here. My plan is to put 1-inch foam board across to insulate it and keep heat from escaping. The biggest culprit is the gap in the peak of the roof, which allows for airflow. Obviously, we won't be impeding this airflow because they'll be spaced off the rafter and there'll still be small gaps, but we should be able to trap the heat in much better than it currently is. While I already picked up the insulation, which you'll see later in the video, I already invited some friends over to test this out. They'll be here shortly, so I'm going to get this thing temporarily set up to see if I like the picture quality and if it'll be good for the space. Included in this package, which is different than most others, is an actual projector screen that I can hang on the back of the garage door. And for the specs this thing is supposed to be, it should be plenty good for my setup. Getting it unpacked, it's time for that satisfying peel. And this thing actually looks half decent compared to the dozens of other Chinese alternatives that have poor quality and questionable reliability. Obviously, I don't know much about the unit until I get it set up for real, but we can at least take a look at the exterior. Here we have our controls on top, which won't be very accessible because of the hanging from the ceiling, but you can see it as a VGA, an HDMI, headphone out for speakers, and an AV in. Also on the other side, you have an IR, HDMI, and USB port, as well as the power cable. Then here you have your two adjustment rings for getting the picture just right. Like I was saying before about it being difficult to reach the buttons on top, luckily it comes with a remote and a couple of cables to get it connected to whatever you're going to be streaming from. This is by no means a tech YouTube channel, but it is a project, and on this channel I share almost all of my projects. And it does involve my primary workspace, the garage. Before I really put my hands on this thing, I'm gonna get cleaned up from working on the mini bike and gather a few supplies so that I can actually get it plugged in and get something streaming to it. Like I mentioned before, this is my stack of foam that I'll eventually be putting up in the rafters to trap the heat in. Before I can go to the store and get 2x4s for a ceiling mount and get this whole thing figured out, I will be using this cart to hold the projector. It's movable, which is perfect for changing the distance of the projector from the screen, and it's stable enough that it won't get easily knocked over by someone. For now, I'll just be hanging a little power strip from the ceiling outlet down to where I need it. I haven't exactly figured out what I want to use to stream to this box, whether that be a laptop, an Xbox 360, or a Blu-ray player, but plugging it in for the first time, I'm surprised on how good it looks, especially in the dark the way it's supposed to be used. Obviously, it's not the sharpest thing for the money I paid, but it is good enough, and it's surprisingly bright for what it is. Like I was saying before, this is a budget setup. Now I'm going to try and see if I can get the Roku to stream some video. Being completely honest, I don't even really need the projection screen because the back of the door is white anyway, and the little hooks and stuff in the middle aren't that distracting. If my friends get here and they think it looks really bad, I'll throw it up because after all, I have these nice racks from the garage door and some bungee cords that I can stretch it across the opening with. I didn't think I was going to like the cart, but after all, it's easy to move out of the way and I can pack everything up inside when I take it down. Pretty appropriate for the time of year it is, but we're going to watch Die Hard tonight. And even just by the start of the intro sequence, it looks pretty good. Obviously, I'll have to update you when the movie starts playing, but as of now, I think this was a great buy. And I do 100% want to reiterate, this is not its final form. This is really just the test go before I start making actual modifications to the garage to accommodate this on a regular basis.
Get together, have a few laughs.
Oh, it's hurting. He is alone, tired, and he hasn't seen diddly squat from anybody down here.
With what I'd call a successful movie night complete, I'm really impressed with the little projector. The first issue that we actually had that wasn't anything to do with the projector itself was internet. This garage is not that far from our Wi-Fi router, but it has to go through a number of walls to actually get connectivity. Eventually, we resorted to stringing my 2 longest HDMI cables together and putting a laptop in the other garage so that it was close enough to the internet source to get a good connection. Obviously, if I go back to using a Blu-ray player, I won't have this issue because discs obviously don't have to buffer. The second biggest issue, like I mentioned before, was the heat. We were all pretty bundled up, so it wasn't that bad in here, but it still got pretty cold and uncomfortable. Obviously, with the insulation, it'll be a lot better, and if I have a quiet space heater running the entire time, it should also be much improved compared to periodically running this loud propane heater. Like I thought I was previously going to do, hanging it from the ceiling, I think instead I'll hang it from the bottom of the loft. As it sits now, it's almost directly below the edge, so I'll probably come down from the backside and then put a shelf forward. Ideally, it'll be able to fold up out of the way or otherwise not interfere with walking through the area. Realizing the tilt adjustment actually has a lot of throw on this projector, I can put it at whatever angle I want to still get it at the right point on the screen and angle it so that it's square. This is another project I kind of expected to be quicker than it's actually end up going to be, but I guess that's alright. I'll have to update you next time I bring out the camera to get that insulation in or make another modification to the projector setup. All in all, this is good news and I'm really happy with my purchase. It's the next day and I still have to clean up a little bit in here, but I gathered some supplies so that I could throw up a shelf and start figuring out where exactly I want this thing to sit permanently. Luckily, I had this scrap piece of plywood and some shelving brackets that I can use to hang it from the loft. The unfortunate thing about working on this during the daytime is that I'll have to throw up some trash bags if I want to do any kind of adjustment for the position and have to see where the projector shoots. With those up, I think it's just dark enough in here to get to work. As you can see, it's plenty bright for getting things squared up, and I also determined that just about this 2x4 is center of the room. And obviously it doesn't matter that much because I'm using a wide shelf that's supposed to allow for movement and accommodate 2 devices, but I think I'm going to mount it just off of center to the right so that the projector can sit on one side and that whatever I'm using to play, like a DVD player, can sit on the other and have the projector still be on center. With my adjusted markings made, I just have to mount these shelf brackets. And before I do so, I'm going to take a little notch out of the bottom of the beveled end of this 2x4 I'm using for a railing post so that I can sit flush with the bottom of the loft. By no means is it a pretty cut, but it'll work for my purposes. And the other thing I have to take into consideration is that using these upside down, it won't just be resting on the brackets, it'll be actively pulling on whatever hardware I use. This means that I'm probably going to oversize the holes that come with the bracket and buy some through bolts that I can nut and bolt with some nice washers so that it'll strongly hold it on instead of relying on screws, which even though I think these would be fine, it is possible for them to not be strong enough for the weight I'm putting on it or eventually get weaker as I toss it up onto the shelf. So I'm going to make a run to the store and update you when I get back. With the proper hardware acquired, I can finally get this thing mounted correctly. Unfortunately, I will have to remount the holes on the original brackets, but they don't have to be that much larger, so I think they'll still be plenty strong to hold up the projector and maybe a DVD player. Unfortunately, like the insulation, this is something I'll have to come back to later. It's the next day, and I'm back again to work on the garage theater setup. It may not be the biggest heater in the world, but this little 1500 watt Duraflame should keep the temps in here up while the movie is running. And I would run this gas one the whole time, but it's extremely loud and gets in the way of enjoying the movie. My plan is to run the gas one while people are showing up or beforehand, and then use the electric one to keep it warmer in here so that the noise stays down during the movies. The first thing I want to do is get back to getting this projector mounted for real. Putting it in this position also makes it accessible to the little media console I made for the small TV and Xbox 360 I used to use in the loft. I'm just now realizing that I never showed off this OG project of mine. I used to absolutely love these Arizona green teas and decided to make a little table to hold the TV I put up in the loft for it. Complete with Arizona canned feet and a cherry blossom painted top, this is a cool little piece. I also realized that I haven't really showed you around much in the loft, but that's because mainly it acts as a storage space. In the past couple of days, I've also been thinking about what I want to do as far as audio goes for a more permanent solution. I have this miscellaneous speaker up here, and a pair that I'm using with a Bluetooth amplifier I got off of Amazon. The one in the loft doesn't get used much and is Frankenstein together, and this pair gets moved around pretty frequently, and I like it that way. Hopefully later in this video you'll see what I have in store as far as audio goes. For now, it's time to get back to getting the shelf mounted. I may or may not have bought the wrong length bolts because I misremembered the thickness of the plywood, but nonetheless, they're extremely solid and I have no worries about the amount of weight that this shelf can carry in terms of the projector and its equipment. Next, I'll get the tripod set up so that you can struggle to watch me throw up this shelf alone with these big meaty screws. One small oversight I made when thinking about this was that this material that the top screw is driving into is 1/2-inch plywood that sits on top of the floor of the loft to keep things from getting kicked off. Sure, it's still very strong, but I may drill a hole and add another screw somewhere down the middle of the bracket to reinforce it. I'm not that worried. As I said earlier, the projector isn't that heavy and I can put a lot of force on this, but once again, I remind you that you should always measure twice and cut once and avoid my mistakes here. Either way, it's mounted and it doesn't look too bad if I say so myself. Now, I'm going to throw the projector up there and the DVD player, see how much space I have, and see if I can actually aim it correctly at the door. With everything roughly tossed in place, I think this setup is going to work quite nicely for me. And as you can see, the cable management is still a mess, but that's because the loft is still unorganized and I'm not sure how exactly I want to run the cables. Being a mess is kind of okay as long as it's out of the way and doesn't impede with the function of the projector or the DVD player. As you can see, one of the biggest problems with running the projector this high is that I need to put a big spacer underneath it in the back to point it downward at the screen. For the most part, it's meant to sit kind of level with the screen it's projecting on, which, as you can see here, puts it way too high on the door. I'm going to have to point it down and then use one of the adjustments to tilt the picture so that it still looks square on screen. If anything, this is really coming together nicely. I'll either pick up the camera next time I go pick up another goodie for the setup, or when I actually have the time to put the insulation in, but for now, that's good night. I'm back for another day to get the solution figured out. I measured this, and to get the screen sitting exactly where I want it, it'd have to be angled down between 10 and 15 degrees. Here, if I had a rack that hung about a foot underneath it, that would be reduced to between 5 and 10 degrees, just enough. Because of the modular capability of threaded rod and putting thread inserts into the wood so that I can adjust it almost infinitely up and down, I think I'm going to go with that solution. If anything, this means I have to go get supplies. With the correct hardware and the length of threaded rod acquired, all I have to do is cut it down to the correct size segments and add the thread inserts into the wood. Oversized hardware, everything is finally mounted up. And as you can see, it's not perfect, but it's not meant to be. As long as it works, I'm happy with it. The other nice thing I took into consideration when deciding on this solution to my problem is that by twisting these little wing nuts here, I can infinitely adjust the angle side to side to get the projector level, and I can even deal with my forward tilt or backward tilt just with these without having to attach anything crazy to the projector. I can imagine that the stool I'm sitting on is taller than most lawn chairs and it still passes the headroom test. And if people don't want to sit underneath it because of this headroom issue, I sit in a super low beach chair anyway, so I could take the middle spot. Sure, it may not be the most stable mount in the world, but it is plenty strong and it'll hold the projector just fine. You've seen me install and tear this thing down more than once now, so I'm going to toss everything on it and get it prepared for another test go. After getting it all set up, you can see it's nearly perfect. And I can say I did have to make a bunch of adjustments with those wing nuts to get the level correct, where it points just where I want it on the screen. I think this is the cheapest and most simple solution that allows the adjustment that I wanted. Optimally, I'd have something that swings down or drops down from the ceiling, but I couldn't think of a cheap or simple way to actually do this. Instead, I just have to unscrew these threaded rods and store the piece of wood and the projector up on top of the shelf. Something that takes less than 5 minutes to set up and get adjusted correctly. Even without insulation, this propane heater puts in work and it's still pretty warm in here, even though it hasn't been running in 10 or 15 minutes. Now I'm going to do some testing. This video, more than others, is a bit all over the place because I'm really figuring this out as I go, trying to stay cheap and simple with this project. But already it's much better than it was a couple days ago. This, I think, is where I'm going to leave it for tonight. And like I said last time, I'll pick the camera up if I get something new for the setup or go to do the installation. While I don't exactly have the time to work on the setup today or start getting that installation in, I just want to add that I finally picked up a decent sound system to go with the setup. This is a Samsung soundbar and subwoofer that I saw on Facebook Marketplace this morning, and it was a deal I absolutely had to pounce on. I'm pretty certain new this would be between $100 or $150 if I had to buy it myself, maybe even more. But I got it for an insane deal, and it'll be a nice addition to improving the sound of the projector setup. As I may have alluded to earlier, I'd like to put the subwoofer somewhere up in the rafters, up underneath the loft, and put the soundbar right above the garage door for the best sound. If anything, this is just another crazy come up for the home theater setup, and this just goes to show that you can work with almost any budget you have if you really try hard enough to get something accomplished. Between all the electronics, the projector itself, the DVD player streaming box, the sound system, and the heater, I'll be well under $200, which is really pretty good for the quality setup this is. Obviously, the insulation will be a much larger cost, but that's not something that everybody has to do because it's really something I have to adapt to the space that I was given. And this heater is something I already had, so I'm not counting it in the budget, but these are also fairly inexpensive and dependent on whatever your setup is. I also have to add that basically all you need is electricity to get something like this working, and a lot of people don't have to deal with the cold like we do up north here. For now, this is me signing off. I guess you'll see when I get that insulation in. Today is finally the day I'm going to get the insulation installed in the garage. After another quick trip to the hardware store, I got correct size bolts and razor blades. As you remember from earlier in the video, the ones I initially installed for the shelf are way too long, so I'm going to get those swapped out. And yes, it is a mess in here, but I'm waiting until I get the project finished up before I can finally clean. As to not rip the entire setup down, I'm going to replace the bolts one by one and show you when I get it done. It's such a small change, but it was bugging me so much before that it makes a big difference. Before I start laying any insulation, I have to make room up in the rafters and grab a ladder that allows me to climb up there. As you can probably guess, the process is pretty simple. Basically, you just throw a piece up into the rafters and notch out any obstructions and get it taped and nailed into place. I don't have the proper tape to get the seam sealed, but I can at least get it nailed up and wait until I can get some. For now, I'm going to get the heater cranking and get to work. This next section will probably be a super long time lapse. And with that said, it's time to get going. I've got the first piece up, and I'm going to have more gaps than anticipated to fill at the bottom and on the sides, but that's all right. That's what the tape and the little stub cutoffs are for. Unfortunately, hanging it up through the loft means I will have to relocate my Christmas lights, which are directly in the way of probably about half of the places I need to mount insulation. I installed the lights. I actually ran them pretty nicely and tucked them up out of the way that perfectly followed the line of the roof. And now it just so happens that all the places I nailed in clips are exactly in the way of the insulation. So inevitably, I think I'll just have to take it all down and redo it again another time after the insulation is up. I'll be sure to restart the time lapse when I start getting sheets drawn. Just like that, the first and bottom row of insulation is installed. And it isn't perfect. I probably should have used a straight edge to make these cuts instead of freehanding them up in the ceiling. But it's close enough because I have tape to seal these gaps. And I think the biggest point where heat leaves is the peak. So that's the most important area anyway. Now it's just rinse and repeat, doing the same process as before, but with cut down sheets of insulation. I'm not trying to make this video half an hour long, so I'll update you when I get that second row put in. It's the same process anyway. Well, I'm not nearly done. I just wanted to stop and appreciate how much better my second round of cuts are coming out. Actually taking the time to use a straight edge after seeing how crappy the freehanded ones were, and getting a better feel for working with the material. This stuff looks so much better. And the more I do it, the cleaner it gets. I'm making good progress, and hopefully I'll finish tonight. After many hours, it's finally done. And I've still got to put these small chunks to block off the bottom of the insulation and the top at the ridgeline of the roof, but at least I have the main panels up. After messing around the heat and being up and down for the last few hours, I noticed that a lot of cold air is coming in the sides and venting out the top, which is what I expected, but I was surprised by how much breeze was coming in these gaps. Even if there's a small gap at the roof, if cold air isn't allowed to go in and there's a reduced amount of airflow, it should keep the warmth in better. This is where the tape really comes in handy for blocking off these gaps and keeping the airflow down by sealing off the panels. Maybe I'll do a time lapse of me doing one side, but it's basically the same thing as before. With one side done, you can at least see what I'm going for. I'm going to tape at the top and the sides of each of these small panels and at all the seams of the larger panels. Now I just have to knock out the other side and cut up pieces to tape in the peak of the roof. I'm not sure if I'll get all this done for tonight, but I'm going to stop the time lapses and get to work and update you when I finally get it complete. The next day has arrived, and with a good selection of tape, I can finally get to working on these seams and getting the peak of the roof closed off. I didn't get everything done last night, but I did get a lot accomplished. I'm probably going to be using this thinner rollout insulation to seal off the peak. Of course, my time lapse is keeping out of focus, and like everything else on this project, this takes a lot longer than I assumed, but I have one half done, and now it's time to do the other side. Both sides taped up, it's now time to tackle the peak of the roof. Like I mentioned before, I'm going to be using this thinner stuff up at the top here to bridge the gap, with tape on either side going down. The installation is finally done, and just like when I started this project, I have people coming over later to watch a movie. I also want to make the disclaimer when I say people are coming over, it's a small number, and these are people I see on a fairly regular basis anyway. Between school and them getting tested for personal reasons, none of us have tested positive in over a month, and we really are trying to keep it safe while still being able to see each other. I also want to note that some goodies came in the mail from Amazon. While it may be fairly unorthodox, I think I'll be using these big hooks to hang the soundbar. How it's mounted, instead of having screw holes where the head of screws slide into, it has protruding fasteners that use some sort of bracket that I don't have. So I think it'll sit fairly nicely in these brackets, and they go almost all the way around it, and will keep it from falling out. As far as the subwoofer goes, I'd like to get it mounted up in the rafters like I said before, but I don't know if I'll have time. So for now, I'll probably just plug it in somewhere here in the back because it is wireless and its positioning doesn't really matter anyway. Now, it's just time to get some power and an audio cable run and the bar put up. The bar's installed and the wires are just kind of tossed up there for now, but we have a time crunch. So this'll do for now. Because there wasn't really enough time to do an update between getting home and getting the setup cleaned and ready for people to come over, I didn't film one, but people just left and it was an astounding success. The new soundbar is not only louder, but it's clearer, and the way it's set up, it actually feels like there's a pair of nice stereo speakers in front of you rather than a dinky little Bluetooth speaker behind you. And even though it's not in the best spot, the subwoofer across the room really makes the sound more encompassing. And even though it's nowhere near the movie theater experience, at least it feels a little bit closer with these new additions. Well, it's not a night and day difference, and I didn't have the crazy heater running before people came over. We started at 51 degrees and ended at about the same temperature. Outside, the temperature dropped nearly 15 degrees though, so at least I know I'm able to maintain the temperature in the garage when it's cold outside. Even though I wouldn't really consider it super warm in here, at least there was no wind or draft blowing through, which is prevented by the insulation and the tape that I installed. Well, I've still got to rehang my Christmas lights. I'm sure this video won't get edited for a while anyway, so I'm going to end it here and come back and update you when I have the setup really finalized. I'd really like to say the setup is coming together nicely and has already accommodated 2 fun movie nights with friends. Editing this video, I realized I never really closed it out. I mentioned I was going to come back with the camera when I got lights hung up, but I'm still waiting to get more of those so that I can properly fill the space with Christmas lights. That's such a small part of the setup, and I just want to get this video out. So I think I'm going to end it here. These videos where I make up everything on the fly are a little bit more chaotic, but hopefully you still got something from watching me set up my little theater setup in the garage. While it's still fairly rudimentary, the setup has been working great for me, and I think it'll just get better as time passes and I make little tweaks to improve it. Anyway, thank you for watching, and if you did enjoy, I'd appreciate it if you liked, commented, or even subscribed to the channel. And for now, this is me signing off.